You didn't click on this by accident. Part of you already knows you can't keep living like this. You clicked because something inside you is exhausted, not from work, not from people, not from life being too hard. You're exhausted from holding a version of yourself together that doesn't quite fit anymore. Think about the last few days. You finished them mentally drained without doing anything that should have cost you that much. You sat in a familiar room around familiar faces and still felt like you were watching everything from behind glass. You had decisions to make, small ones, simple ones, and your mind went completely blank. Not because you didn't know the answer, because every option felt like the wrong direction. That's not burnout, that's not laziness, that's not a bad week. That is what happens when the person you're performing every single day stops matching the person you actually are underneath it. There's a name for this. There's a mechanism, and it has nothing to do with weakness or failure. It has everything to do with how the human brain responds when identity and behavior pull in opposite directions for too long. That tension doesn't fade on its own. It compounds. And today, you're going to understand exactly why and exactly what's already happening inside you because of it. Something shifted. You may not know exactly when, but part of you felt it. Not a crisis, not a breakdown. Something quieter and far more disorienting than either of those. A slow withdrawal from your own life. You're still inside it, still moving through it, still performing every role it asks of you. But the presence you used to bring to it, that's been somewhere else for a while now. And the symptoms are precise. Things that once required no effort, now require a full internal debate before you can begin them. Not because they got harder, because something in you stopped cooperating with the direction they're pointing. You sit down to start, and your mind doesn't wander. It resists, quietly, persistently, without explanation. You feel it in rooms you know by heart. Conversations that should feel easy carry a strange weight. Familiar faces, familiar routines, and underneath all of it, a distance you can't close no matter how present you try to appear. Then there's the fatigue that sleep doesn't touch. That low, structureless drain that's already waiting when you open your eyes. No injury, no illness, nothing you can explain to anyone without sounding like you're complaining about a life that looks completely fine from the outside. Here is exactly what's happening inside you. When your behavior and your actual identity run in opposite directions long enough, the brain stops treating it as a scheduling problem and starts treating it as a threat. It begins rationing cognitive energy, pulling resources away from execution, from initiation, from the kind of full presence that makes life feel inhabited rather than just managed. This isn't your character failing you. This is your nervous system refusing to keep funding a performance it no longer believes in. The exhaustion isn't the problem. It's the most honest thing about you right now. At some point, you got very good at being someone people could count on. Not fake, not dishonest, just calibrated. You learned which version of yourself made rooms easier to be in, which responses kept things smooth, which edges to soften, which needs to postpone, which parts of yourself to leave outside the door before walking in. And it worked. It made you effective, likable, reliable. It made life more manageable. So you kept doing it. The adaptation that started as a strategy slowly became a default. The version of you that was built for external approval started running on autopilot, answering before you could think, reacting before you could feel, deciding based on what was expected before you could even ask yourself what you actually wanted. You didn't lose yourself dramatically. No single moment of betrayal, no obvious breaking point. You adapted, repeatedly, intelligently, and every small adaptation felt completely reasonable in the moment it happened, until the accumulation became the identity. Here's the mechanism your brain was running the entire time. Social belonging registers in the nervous system as survival, not metaphorically, neurologically, which means any behavior that secured your place in a group, a relationship, a role, felt like safety, and your brain, wired to prioritize safety above almost everything else, kept reinforcing those behaviors regardless of whether they reflected who you actually were. Authenticity never stood a chance against that calculus. Not because you're weak, because you're human. Because every person walking this earth has constructed a functional version of themselves for exactly the same reason, and most of them have never stopped to notice that the construction took over. You didn't perform a character. You became one. And the exhaustion you feel now is the distance between that character and the person underneath it, finally refusing to be ignored. Nobody tells you that pretending has a price tag, not a moral one. not a philosophical one, a biological one, paid in real cognitive currency, withdrawn from your mental reserves every single day, whether you're aware of it or not. Here's what's actually running in the background of your mind right now. Every time you respond in a way that doesn't match what you genuinely feel, your brain has to execute a small but costly operation, suppress the authentic signal, generate the acceptable one, monitor the delivery, scan the environment for approval. That sequence happens in milliseconds. It feels like nothing, but it runs hundreds of times a day, and it compounds. This is why you end days that looked effortless on paper feeling completely hollowed out. This is why simple decisions, what to eat, what to say, what to do next, can feel inexplicably heavy. Your decision-making system isn't malfunctioning, it's overdrawn. It's been processing an invisible tax on every interaction, every response, every moment you managed your presentation instead of simply existing inside it. And then comes the avoidance. When the cognitive load crosses a certain threshold, the brain stops tolerating ambiguity. It starts steering away from anything that requires more processing, new challenges, meaningful conversations, actions that demand genuine self-direction. Not because you've become lazy, because your system is protecting its last reserves. What looks like procrastination from the outside is triage happening on the inside. What feels like paralysis is your mind hitting a ceiling it built entirely from sustained performance. The life that should feel like yours starts feeling like a set you walk through. The things that once energized you start feeling distant, theoretical, belonging to some earlier version of yourself you can barely remember. You're not burned out from living. You're depleted from the simulation running underneath it. And simulations, no matter how sophisticated, always cost more than the real thing. You didn't stumble onto this randomly. And before you dismiss that as something mystical or conveniently poetic, stay with it for a moment, because what actually happened here is more interesting than coincidence, and more precise than luck. Your brain has been quietly changing its filters. When internal conflict reaches a certain intensity, when the gap between who you are and who you've been performing grows wide enough, something shifts in your attentional architecture. Your mind stops filtering out information that's relevant to that conflict and starts pulling it toward the surface. Patterns you ignored for years become impossible to unsee. Words that once slid past you now land with unexpected weight. Content that would have meant nothing 6 months ago suddenly feels like it was written directly for you. This is called attentional salience. And it isn't passive. It's your nervous system actively reorganizing what deserves your focus. Because the conflict you've been carrying has crossed a threshold your brain can no longer afford to deprioritize. The discomfort got loud enough that your mind started scanning for resolution. And resolution requires information, new frameworks, a different lens. So here you are, not because an algorithm got lucky, but because something in you was already looking, already leaning toward whatever might finally name what you've been feeling. The content didn't find a passive viewer. It found a system primed for recognition. And recognition is where everything begins to move. Think about how different this moment feels compared to the last 100 things you scrolled past without a second thought. That difference isn't aesthetic. It isn't the topic. It's timing. Internal timing. The kind that has nothing to do with a calendar and everything to do with how close you've gotten to a threshold you can't uncross. This isn't coincidence. This is your own mind, finally ready to look directly at something it spent a long time learning to avoid. You've called it procrastination. You've called it laziness. You've called it fear of failure, lack of discipline, self-sabotage. You've built entire narratives around why you don't do the things you know you should. And every single one of those narratives missed the actual mechanism. Avoidance has nothing to do with effort. It's a protection system, sophisticated, automatic, and running entirely below the level of conscious decision-making. And what it's protecting you from isn't failure. Failure you can recover from, rationalize, absorb. What it's protecting you from is something the brain treats as far more dangerous than failure. Identity disruption. When an action carries the potential to fundamentally alter who you are, or more precisely, who your brain currently believes you to be, the nervous system doesn't weigh the pros and cons. It doesn't calculate risk versus reward. It generates resistance. Immediate, irrational, disproportionate resistance that has no logical explanation, because it was never operating on logic to begin with. This is why the things you avoid most aggressively are rarely the hardest things. They're the most identity-relevant things. The project that would prove something real about you. The conversation that would change a relationship permanently. The decision that once made cannot be quietly unmade. These aren't avoided because they're difficult. They're avoided because completing them would require you to become someone slightly different than who you are right now. And your brain, running its ancient threat detection software, treats that shift as danger, so it manufactures distraction. It generates fatigue precisely when you sit down to begin. It floods you with suddenly urgent, completely trivial alternatives. It is extraordinarily creative in its avoidance, because the stakes, neurologically speaking, feel extraordinarily high. The thing you keep not doing isn't waiting for your motivation to arrive. It's waiting for your identity to catch up with where you're actually trying to go. And those are two completely different problems with two completely different solutions. Something has already happened to you that you can't undo. Not a decision, not an event, a shift in perception. And perception, once expanded, has no reverse gear. You cannot unsee what you've seen. You cannot unfeel what's been named. The moment awareness enters a blind spot, that blind spot ceases to exist, and everything that was hiding inside it comes with it. This is the part nobody warns you about. Most people assume that understanding their patterns will make them easier to maintain. That insight creates distance, a comfortable intellectual space where you can observe yourself without the observation changing anything. But that's not how this works. Awareness doesn't create observers. It creates pressure, because now, every time the automatic behavior runs, every rehearsed response, every suppressed reaction, every moment you perform the functional character instead of inhabiting your actual self, you feel it. Not vaguely, precisely, with a clarity that the old version of you simply didn't have access to, and that clarity is not comfortable. Cognitive dissonance at this level isn't a philosophical inconvenience. It's a lived physical tension that builds with every interaction where your behavior and your awareness point in opposite directions. The performance that once ran silently in the background now runs loudly, and you are standing right next to the machinery, fully conscious of every gear. You cannot go back to not knowing, which means the only direction that actually relieves the pressure is forward. Not because forward is easy, not because change is painless or guaranteed or clean, but because the alternative, continuing to perform a version of yourself you can now see clearly, costs more than it ever did before. The self-awareness you've developed doesn't make pretending sustainable. It makes pretending unbearable. And unbearable, as uncomfortable as it feels right now, is exactly the condition that precedes every real transformation a human being ever makes. You're not at a crossroads. You're past one. Every piece of advice you've ever received about change had the same hidden assumption buried inside it, that what you need is more. More willpower, more intensity, more commitment, a bigger decision, a stronger resolution, a more dramatic break from everything that came before. That assumption is wrong, and it's kept more people stuck than almost anything else. Real control doesn't look like an explosion. It doesn't arrive with momentum and clarity, and a sudden certainty about exactly who you're becoming. Real control is almost embarrassingly small when you first encounter it. A single conscious choice made in a moment that would have previously run on autopilot. Nothing cinematic, nothing worth posting about. Just a half-second pause between stimulus and response where you decide what happens next, instead of your conditioning deciding for you. That pause is everything, because the gap between who you've been performing and who you actually are doesn't close through grand gestures. It closes through consistency, small, deliberate, almost invisible acts of self-direction repeated across ordinary moments that nobody else will ever notice or applaud. This is what agency actually feels like from the inside. Not powerful, not transformative in any single instance, just slightly more aligned than the moment before it. A response that felt genuinely yours instead of automatic. A decision made from internal direction rather than external expectation. A moment where you didn't manage yourself for someone else's comfort. These moments don't feel significant when they happen, but they accumulate in the only place that matters, inside your identity. Each one shifts the baseline slightly. Each one makes the next conscious choice fractionally easier. Each one chips away at the architecture of the performed self and replaces it, quietly and permanently, with something that actually belongs to you. Intensity fades, motivation fluctuates, emotion is unreliable. Consistency is the only mechanism that has ever actually worked. Because it doesn't require you to feel ready. It only requires you to move. Most people finish something like this and immediately ask the wrong question. They ask, "What should I change?" And that question, however well-intentioned, sends them straight back into the same system that created the problem, reaching outward for a prescription, an external structure, a mapped route someone else designed for a journey only they can take. The right question is different, and it's far more uncomfortable. What have I been pretending not to notice? That's where this actually begins. Not with transformation, not with reinvention. With observation, raw, honest, judgment-free observation of the automatic behaviors you've been running so long. They stopped feeling like choices and started feeling like personality. Here's the only thing you need to do in the next 24 hours. Watch yourself. Don't intervene. Don't correct. Don't perform awareness for your own internal audience by immediately trying to fix what you see. Just observe the machinery in motion, the responses that arrive before you've consciously chosen them, the moments you shrink without deciding to, the times you say yes while something quieter inside you says something else entirely. This isn't passive. It's the most precise thing you can do right now, because change built on top of unexamined behavior is just a new layer of performance. But change that begins with clear sight of what's actually running, that change has roots. It has a foundation that doesn't collapse the moment life gets complicated or uncomfortable or inconvenient. Awareness precedes every identity shift that has ever lasted, not as a warm-up, not as a preliminary step you graduate from quickly on your way to the real work, as the real work itself. You've spent years becoming fluent in a version of yourself that was built for survival in other people's environments. Fluency in your own takes time. It takes attention. It takes exactly the kind of honest, unhurried observation that the performing self has always found most threatening. Start there, not with force, not with a plan, with your eyes open. You made it here. And that's not a small thing. Not because this was long, because this was honest. And honesty has a weight that entertainment never carries. Something in you stayed because something in you recognized itself. And recognition, real recognition, is one of the rarest experiences a human being can have. So let's be clear about what just happened. You didn't watch a video about self-improvement. You watched a video about the specific architecture of your own internal conflict, the gap between who you are and who you've been performing, the neurological cost of sustaining that gap, and the precise moment when awareness makes continuing it impossible. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are not someone who needs to be fixed. You are someone who is finally seeing clearly. And clear sight, however uncomfortable it feels in this exact moment, is the only real foundation any lasting change has ever been built on. The work ahead isn't dramatic. It isn't urgent in the way urgency is usually sold. It's quiet, consistent, and entirely yours. Built in the half-second pauses, the small, honest choices, the moments you decide to inhabit yourself instead of manage yourself. That work starts now. Not tomorrow. Not after the next video, the next insight, the next version of yourself you've been promising to become. Now, if this found something real in you, drop the words "done pretending" in the comments. Not for engagement, as a marker, a timestamp of the moment you stopped looking away. And if you're ready to go deeper into how identity actually shifts, how the brain rewires, how behavior changes at the root level, the next video is already waiting for you. This is where change actually begins.